What's up, everyone? Good morning. It's your host, Carlos Ponce here, and this is episode 20 of Advancio Talks. And we are live, and today we've got Adam Watson, CEO of MeCo Diagnostics, with us today. And I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute. Thank you. Thank you, Adam, for being with us today.
It's great to be here.
Um, sure. For those viewers out there, if you are just discovering us, welcome to the show. And if you've been here since the beginning, since 2022, well, you know what we are about. Advancio Talks is where we sit down with the people actually building the future of business and technology, and not just talking about it, but doing it. You know, CTOs, founders, the folks actually making decisions that matter. So whether you're drinking coffee, commuting, or just curious about what's actually happening in tech and in business, stick around. Adam's got stories and insights you will not hear anywhere else. So let's jump in. Adam, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure, Adam. So, Adam, I'd like to start the show, of course, with you. Tell us a little bit about you. Who is Adam Watson? How'd you get here? What's your journey? Anything you want to share with the audience about who you are?
So I'm actually Canadian. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and did my undergrad degree there in microbiology. And then I came to the US to study for my PhD, which I did in cancer biology. And actually, my dissertation research project became my company, MeCo Diagnostics. So I'm the lead inventor of our technology, our lead asset, which is a predictive biomarker test for breast cancer. And we'll get into what that means. But going from research and development into commercialization has really been the path that I've been on for the last 12 years. So it's really been exciting. I've been focusing on just one very particular problem that the world is facing, and unfortunately, it's a problem that's getting worse. For the almost the last 15 years now, I've been focusing on the problem of breast cancer, and specifically early stage breast cancer, and how we can prevent it from progressing to late stage cancer, and how we can do so without bankrupting families, which is really an increasing problem that American families are facing more so than ever. The amount of cancer debt is at an all-time high right now. So this is really one of the major problems that we are seeking to rectify with our company.
And that's quite commendable, by all means. You know, when I hear the cancer debt, you know, I just can't conceive how, you know, we can get into debt by other reasons, right? Voluntarily, but this is something that has nothing to do with doing it voluntarily, right? So thank you for sharing your mission, your vision with us today. So tell us a little bit about the company. Tell us about MeCo Diagnostics, please.
Yeah, so we are a tech transfer. You know, we're a spin out of the University of Arizona. Since I invented our technology with my PhD advisor, who's now the company co-founder. He's a professor at the University of Arizona. So as a result, the university owns the actual IP, the patents, and so we have a license, an exclusive license, to our discovery, and we've been operating for about 3.5 years now, full time. We're still a fairly small company. We have currently about 6 people working with us. And we've raised just over $1 million in pre-seed. We have 3 publications, 2 of which are very high impact. And so we've been really fortunate to have done a lot with relatively little in a period of time that has historically been quite difficult for medtech startups and diagnostics companies in general. About 10 years ago, there was a big flood of money into diagnostics, and a lot of it didn't pan out, not because of the technology itself, but it's a regulated market. And when it comes to reimbursement, which is really how investors ultimately get paid back, it can be sometimes quite difficult in order to change the standard of care in medicine so that diagnostics really become part of the equation. And so we've really had to work through a sort of difficult landscape of waning interest in diagnostics. But we're really fortunate that we have a truly first-in-class, product that addresses a huge unmet need, and that is our MeCo Score test. So it's a predictive biomarker test for breast cancer. And it's
Mhm.
the only test that can match patients with a new kind of therapy called anti-fibrotic therapy. So
Mhm.
we're actually doing drug repurposing. And we're doing that for a couple of reasons. Instead of doing drug development, which is very, very difficult and laborious and requires a lot of endurance and a lot of money and usually fails, drug repurposing is often successful because you can start with a drug that has very well-known properties, well-known safety, long track record, and then use it for a different disease. Now, in this case, we don't sell the drug. What we do is we sell a test that matches patients to that drug. And so this is sort of a way that we can unlock a lot of value and savings for patients and payers by, in this case, matching patients to a drug that will soon be a low-cost generic drug. And so this is what's really exciting for us, is to be able to innovate in a way that brings value to our company as a test seller, but then also massive savings for patients. So instead of having to pay for some of these new cancer medicines that can cost $250,000 in total treatment costs, we're talking about a fraction, orders of magnitude less, probably
Mhm.
100-fold less. And that's really exciting for us. And that's basically the core mission of our company is to find new uses for old safe drugs, and then develop tests that match patients to those drugs.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating on what your company does. Now, I like to kind of move on to the topic of today's conversation that we were just talking a few minutes ago about cancer death. So I guess that, which is something that I still can't believe that in this day and age of so many resources available for a lot of people, we're still getting in debt for these reasons, right? So tell us. I'd like to talk about. Uh, Precisely this concept of cancer death and how biotech innovation can and technology can transform cancer care. Would you mind elaborating on this a little bit, please?
Yeah, that when I was in grad school, I never thought about the economics of breast cancer. Some of the smartest people I know were grad students with me, and they work at pharma developing drugs, and they're doing fantastic work. The heartbreaking thing is that once they put in all this time and effort in developing new drugs, then someone else in the company, not a scientist, usually someone with an MBA, they will then price that drug and market it and sell it. And what's happened now is that the cost of new cancer drugs is astronomical.
Hmm.
About 10 years ago, the average cost of a new cancer medicine coming to market was about $60,000 a year. And everyone thought that was crazy. That's way too high. Now it's over $250,000 a year per patient in treatment costs for
Wow.
the list prices of drugs. So what's happening is, despite all the exciting things going on, and people love to talk about how AI is going to just unleash this barrage of new therapies, I
Hmm.
don't care about new therapies unless they are going to be affordable. I just don't care anymore. It's gone to the point that what's the point of developing new drugs if we can't afford them as a society?
Absolutely.
And so this is really something that drove me and motivates me every day. There's a lot of ways that we can repurpose old safe drugs that are either they don't have patent protection anymore, or there's only a couple of years left of patent protection, so there's soon to be some low cost generic versions. This is a really amazing opportunity to innovate in a completely new way. So we're not innovating in drug development, we're innovating in patient selection.
Hmm.
In our case, we match patients with an anti-fibrotic drug. It's not a drug that's even used for any cancer, any type of
Hmm.
cancer in the US. It's used for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is a non-cancer condition, and we're repurposing it for breast cancer. And the reason for that is, the basic science that I did as a grad student identified some common underlying mechanisms, biological mechanisms that drive both of these diseases that are seemingly very different, but they share common
Hmm.
drivers. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for us to help patients, by reducing the risk of recurrence, which we've done dramatically in our phase 2 study, but also to alleviate some of the financial toxicity.
Hmm.
And the thing with cancer debt, often people say, well, debt doesn't chase you after death, and the truth is it does. And the way that happens is if you take out debt in your name to pay for your cancer treatment, it doesn't work, and you die, your family's it's you're shielded from that. But that's not
Hmm.
really what's happening. What's happening, and this is happening in my family and many others, I hear about this all the time. People will remortgage their houses, they'll drain their kids' college funds, And that is the debt that chases, right? Because even if
Mhm.
that therapy that's really expensive that you paid for by remortgaging your house with your family, even if you die and the treatment doesn't work, your house is still remortgaged. That your family is now living, with the grief in that house. And
Mhm.
so it's just salt in the wound, and this is happening more and more. I just heard of a firsthand account of a guy who recently passed away. He's been paying for his wife's failed brain cancer therapy for 30 years after her
Wow.
death. 30 years. So,
Wow.
there's one thing I really want people to realize now, it's that cancer debt can outlive cancer patients by years or even decades now. And that's something people need to think about when they get excited about new therapies. Who's going to pay for it, and how are we
Who's
going to do
gonna, who's gonna foot the bill, right? So yeah, I think that's something that we should all think about, right? Okay, so let me go back a little bit. Let's get into the very fiber of what you're doing. Is you've validated your test across what 4,000 patients?
Yeah, so we've done 4 studies. 3 of them are published, and the test it has a couple of different aspects to it. So it's both prognostic; it tells us the general prognosis of a patient,
Hmm.
irrespective of therapy. But what's more interesting and what makes it truly unique is that it's the first and only predictive biomarker for antifibrotic therapy, which means it can predict which patients benefit from antifibrotic therapy. And that's really exciting because, in our phase 2 study that we did in collaboration, with the Spanish National Cancer Research Center and published last year, it was 130 patients in a randomized controlled trial. And we predicted beforehand which of the patients could benefit from an antifibrotic drug that was used early on before surgery. It's called the neoadjuvant setting. And this is a short period of treatment. It's just 3 months long. So we did this study, and we did 10-year follow-up, and we were able to correctly predict the patients who could benefit. And the benefit was enormous. There was a 62% reduction in the risk of recurrence over 10 years. Now that's twice as good as the best currently approved drug for these patients. And when I say these patients, I mean the most common subtype of the most common cancer in the US. This is a huge group of patients. And right now, the best available drug for them is a drug called Verzenio. And it has a list price of about $15,000 a month. Patients take it for 2 years. And despite that, they only reduce their risk of recurrence by 30%. We've doubled that reduction in risk, but we're only treating patients for 3 months instead of 2 years.
Hmm.
So in addition to lowering costs by matching patients to a soon-to-be generic drug, we're shortening the treatment duration and then also doubling the efficacy. So we really are doing something that's faster, better, and cheaper all at once.
Absolutely. So, okay. Uh, what would you say were the biggest in the when you're talking about validation of your test across many thousands of patients? So, what were the biggest technology infrastructure challenges in collecting, processing, and analyzing that volume of clinical data?
I mean, so a lot of that's been simplified, using bioinformatic techniques. Certainly, it wasn't just me on the team. I mean,
Mhm.
throughout the 3 papers we published so far, there's 30 or more authors. These are scientists, experts with a variety of different skill sets. My job really was to lead the research effort, to sort of quarterback the effort, and also the biggest struggles weren't really technological. We actually built our test on Illumina RNA sequencing. Illumina is the most common type of genomic sequencing, as a platform that's done out there. So we picked the most common platform to make it really easy and integratable with most hospital systems. And so we didn't really have technological issues. The issues that we faced were largely bureaucratic, and there are just structural hurdles in the American healthcare system
Mhm.
that really prevent better, faster, and cheaper solutions from becoming the standard of care. And that's
Mhm.
been the most difficult thing for me to navigate and to just understand and just sit with and think about, is that just because it's some drug or device is better, faster, and cheaper, that does not necessarily mean it's going to win in the long run, because
Right.
there's so many different layers and hurdles, obstacles that are frankly completely artificial, that have been put in place in order to preserve the status quo. But the status
Mhm.
quo is terrible. I mean, the health outcomes for patients across the board are just getting incrementally better, and yet the cost of healthcare is skyrocketing. And that really tells you that we're getting less and less value for the money we put in.
Right.
And the solutions are out there. But in order to translate those solutions into practical, working solutions rather than just theoretical, there needs to be these sort of bureaucratic wins that you kind of have to collect. And that's really the tough part. It's not the science, it's really the politics and the art of, implementing a new solution.
Yeah, you mentioned the word hurdles, right? So, and I'm assuming from what I'm hearing is that these hurdles have come from, or might come from, let's say, integration with existing healthcare systems and workflows, right? At,
Yep.
I don't know, maybe the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I've grown to appreciate, I'm a cancer biologist. I have a PhD in cancer biology. I'm not a medical professional, strictly speaking. I don't have a medical doctor. I don't have an MD. So, as a result, even though what I do is very closely aligned with oncology, I'm not an oncologist. And so I never really appreciated the difficulty that oncologists face, especially in breast cancer. Breast cancer is the most common cancer. It has the most subtypes of the disease that all require different sort of interventions with different times, different diagnostic technologies, and as a result of this rapid change that we're seeing in which is really, it's superficially, it's a really great thing that we have so much promising changes happening right now. It's really difficult for oncologists who are seeing patients, maybe they're teaching, they're training, they're also having to keep up with all these advancements. Now, small companies like mine, we don't have budgets to sneak into the hospital cafeterias and schmooze the physicians and try to get them to, test or use or trial our drug or device. We don't have those options. Big pharma does, and this is largely why the incumbents can sort of slow the progress, the progress and the change, because they really have resources to sort of limit the impact and the speed at which the adoption of new drugs and diagnostics can take place. And so that's really these sort of systems that you're talking about. Absolutely, there's a really human sociological element into getting a new drug or diagnostic test to be the standard of care, to be widely adopted and then reimbursed by payers. And a lot of that really comes down to human interactions. And so it's really not about the science at all. It's about the personal relationships, gaining the trust and the credibility of the oncologists, who are very busy, as I said, and being able to get their attention long enough to really change their mind. And that's been a really difficult thing. And it's I just can't imagine how stressed oncologists must be these days, with increasing rates of cancer, increasing rates of financial toxicity, which reduces compliance with their patients. Patients more and more now are actually foregoing therapy because of costs, sometimes not even telling their oncologist, which leads to lower success rates, and that's putting more pressure on their oncologists. So really, it's a difficult time for oncologists, and it's hard enough for them without me trying to get their attention to say, look at this new thing that you should consider doing. And so it's just a matter of day and night, we're just working at it.
Right. I remember early on, I think a little bit, the beginning of the conversation, we're talking about the costs involved in cancer treatment. So this has an impact in what could be freely called cancer treatment economics, right? So when you talk about transforming cancer treatment economics, what role does health tech innovation play in actually making these cost savings accessible to patients and providers?
Yeah. So, I think what we're doing, so, you would think that our main mission is to, make as much money for our shareholders as possible. And that seems to, that might seem to be, up against the idea of trying to save patients money. And the reason why it's not is because what essentially we'll be doing, if we're successful, is taking money out of big pharma and putting it back into the pockets of patients, because a test is always cheaper than a drug, right? So if you can make money off of a test that matches patients from, going from an expensive drug to a cheap drug, the savings in the drug cost is vastly more than the amount of any diagnostic test, right? And so if you think about that, what I said before, just some of these general numbers, the new drugs coming out for hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer, which is the main subtype. It's the subtype that we study. These drugs that are coming out approved for that subtype, $15,000, $20,000 a month in treatment costs. whereas a generic drug that we're matching patients to will soon be $100 a month. So that amount, just for 1 month, the savings in 1 month is way more than the cost of our test, which will be about $3,000, $3,500. So what's really interesting is, health tech innovation can save money by reallocating resources. And so, there's winners and losers, right? The winners are going to be patients. The losers are going to be pharma companies that don't have good drugs that still cost a lot of money, and they're still being used because there isn't an alternative. And so ultimately, there is going to be a shift in where these resources are being spent. And I think that's really where health tech can come in. And especially for what we're doing, we're helping cancer patients, but we're also serving as a proof of concept that you can make a lot of money by saving patients money. And it's just by reallocating resources away from expensive drugs to cheap drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are, you've done a lot of research, right? So I understand your research has been published in top tier journals like Cell and Science. How important is data visualization and software tools in communicating complex biomarker data to clinicians and researchers?
Yeah, it's getting tougher and tougher. I will say that, with new drugs that are coming out, it requires combination therapies. And so you can imagine if you're testing A against B, that's one thing. But if you're testing, C against A and B, as time goes on and more complexity enters into the equation on how to treat what patients and when for how long with what combination of drugs, it starts to get really complicated. And that is, perhaps one of the reasons for the slow adoption. There's just so much to consider now, and it really is crucial that data be presented in a way that can be understandable. And it's not something that is always done great. We struggle as well with being able to communicate how our therapy is going to be rolled out. For instance, antibiotic therapy in our clinical trial was used with chemotherapy, and then the control group was chemotherapy alone. And some people hear that and they say, well, you talk about the benefits of antifibrotic therapy, given that it's low toxicity, it's well tolerated by patients, but you're giving it with chemo, which, as everyone knows, these are toxic drugs, not well tolerated at all. They make you lose your hair. That's how toxic they are. And so they say, why you're not improving things? It's like, well, actually, it's not even ethical for us to do a clinical trial without giving the chemo to the patients, because chemo is the standard of care, and we know it works despite its drawbacks. And so we do have to combine antifibrotic therapy with a toxic therapy. And it's just because that is what is expected, because we know it works. And so it does get quite difficult in order to make a lot of progress, just because of the sort of ethical guidelines that we have to follow. Withholding chemotherapy from high-risk patients is not ethical. They have to get chemotherapy. The question is, should they also get another therapy on top of it to help the chemotherapy? And that's exactly what our test does, is it finds the patients that can benefit from the addition of antifibrotic therapy to the chemo they're already going to get. And in this case, unfortunately, we can massively reduce the risk of recurrence by adding in this low toxicity, well-tolerated oral drug just for 3 months of treatment time, which is a really big win for patients.
Yeah. Speaking of toxicity, there's also that term that I honestly I hadn't heard it like that before. I like financial toxicity. I liked it. So I'd like to ask you about that. So you mentioned that cancer death can outlive patients by years. So how can health tech solutions help address the financial toxicity of cancer treatment beyond just lowering drug costs?
Well, yeah. So I'll give you an example. Our test, the MeCo Score, it's a software-based test that just produces a report that tells an oncologist whether or not any given patient is a good match for antifibrotic therapy. If they are, then we already know that patient will have a dramatically reduced risk of recurrence. Now, because they have a reduced risk of recurrence, if they don't recur, they won't need second-line, third-line drugs and then end-of-life care, right? Because if we can cure a patient early on with an inexpensive test and an inexpensive generic drug that goes along with that, then they won't need these expensive drugs that they would be getting otherwise. So we can actually just completely circumvent expensive drugs by curing patients early on. And so that's what we're doing. It's one of the reasons why we're so excited to be able to intervene in patients at the earliest stage, because then if there's no evidence of disease left after the surgeon removes their breast tumor, then they can sometimes forego some of these very long-term, 5-year-long hormone therapies that can really add up in terms of both the out-of-pocket costs and the cost to payers. So financial toxicity can be reduced with health tech by matching patients with cheap drugs that then obviate or prevent the need for more expensive drugs. And so that's really how we can do it.
This is extremely interesting. I mean, there's a ton of questions that I would like to ask. Unfortunately, we only have time for a couple more, so I'd like to focus on the next question, which is let's call it to broaden the spectrum of what you're doing with MeCo Diagnostics. In that sense, in the broader sense, what technology wins have surprised you most in your journey from research to building a commercial diagnostic company?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I think that ultimately I have been surprised, mostly at the resiliency of some of the big incumbents, the resiliency toward change, whether that's positive or negative. And so even when there's high impact primary research that's done showing that some new type of technology can improve the sensitivity or specificity of any sort of given test, right, against a gold standard. If we can reduce the cost of some test, or improve upon the selection of patients, or for something, these seem like really obvious, especially if they're peer reviewed and published in high impact journals and get a wide reception in the media. What I'm really most surprised at is how it's rare for those to translate from big splashy media stories, like headline grabbers. Everyone listening to this has had this same experience many times. You hear, oh, bee venom, it's going to cure cancer now, right? Just randomly, I read that the other day. How many times do you hear, oh, there's this next big cure, and oh, this science is so amazing, and then it's just crickets. Years and years go by, and then you think, oh, what happened? I thought they were going to cure cancer 20 years ago, a million different times. And the truth is, there are so many good diagnostics and drugs that are just waiting to be developed further and commercialized, but it is just so hard, despite mounting evidence for any given success of a new intervention. What surprises me the most is how rare it actually happens. And so this is why we're still using very toxic modalities despite all of this crazy innovation that people have read about for 20 years.
Right. So my last question for you, Adam, is as you aim, or as you scale towards broader adoption, what technical engineering, software engineering, or technical capabilities will be most critical to delivering the MeCo Score efficiently across diverse healthcare settings?
Yeah, so I think advances in cloud computing, also advances in data security. This is a really big issue. I'm very sensitive to that issue as well. Even when I go to the doctor, I'm reluctant to speak freely, just because I don't trust HIPAA to prevent my health information, from being released. I always joke with people, if you smoked one cigarette 30 years ago, never, ever admit that to a doctor, right? Because even if it's just conversational and they put that in a database, and then the database gets hacked, and then some insurer, 30 years later says, oh, you were a smoker. You're like, no, I just smoked a cigarette one time at a party 30 years ago in college. I'm really reluctant to trust data security, health data. And so I think that one of the biggest, things that I'm excited about is seeing all the innovation in data security and data management, quality management systems in both cloud computing and cloud storage, distributed networks. Because until we can all have, a lot of faith that our information, our personal health information, isn't going to be hacked or lost or misplaced, until that happens, it's going to be really difficult to convince everyone to really lean into these much more efficient processes of distributed networks, rather than manually going through physical faxed records that we're still doing for health records in a lot of places. We'll save a lot of money and increase efficiency if we can digitize things, but we can't digitize things until we're really certain that data security and compliance is really up to snuff.
Yeah, I'm sure there's, we can go on and on, because the subject itself is extremely interesting. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I would like to encourage our viewers to, go visit your website, learn about you. How can viewers get a hold of you or learn more about the company?
Yeah, you can go to our website, mecodiagnostics.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's
right there.
just Adam Watson, PhD. And yeah, reach out. We're always interested in engaging with patients, patient advocates, families of patients. It's amazing. It really inspires me to continue doing what we're doing, just hearing about the difficulties that, frankly, a lot of people have, even if they're well insured. And so, I just really want people, as a take-home message, to realize that insurance is not the shield that you expect it to be when you need it the most. And so I would hate for people to find that out, just like our family did. With my aunt was diagnosed with advanced cancer. Her family suffered a lot of financial toxicity, despite the fact she had excellent health insurance. So I think that it's really important for people to understand the importance of reducing healthcare costs, and it's not going to come through drug development alone, because new drugs are too expensive. So we need to repurpose old, safe, cheap drugs in order to really bring down the cost of healthcare.
And you mentioned you're on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
Right, Adam? So let's see, what I have for you here is you can find Adam, and on LinkedIn, it's right there, the handle, right? LinkedIn/Adam-Watson-PhD. And also, do you have an email that you can share with the audience as well?
It's just adam@mecodiagnostics.com. And again, we're always interested in, hearing people's perspectives and, their journeys, and, some of the surprising things they dealt with as well, because that often gives me, more things to really think about and talk about. And so it's always really a pleasure to be able to speak with, patients and families of patients.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, it's been a pleasure to have you here in the show. All good things must come to an end. And I just want to encourage folks to stay tuned for more upcoming great interviews right here on Advancio Talks. You know where to find us, advanciotalks.com/tech-talks. So that being said, thank you so much, Adam, for having been with us on the show today. Please stay with me as we go off the air, and the rest of you, thank you for having watched the show, and see you next time right here on Advancio Talks next Wednesday at 11 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. Thank you. See you next time.